My stepdad said, "If you want to keep living here, you'll start paying rent, $3,200 a month." So I bought the house from the landlord that same day. The look on his face when I handed him his eviction notice was priceless. I, 29M, never thought I'd end up back in my childhood home at 29, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. After my startup went belly up and my apartment lease ended simultaneously, Mom insisted I come stay with her for a few months while I figured things out. She'd remarried 3 years ago to someone I barely knew, and I figured it would be awkward but temporary. I had savings, solid job prospects, and a plan to be out within 60 days maximum. What I didn't anticipate was walking into a situation that would turn my entire life upside down. The house itself was a modest 3-bedroom in a decent neighborhood, nothing fancy but comfortable. Mom had lived there for almost 15 years, long before she met her new husband. She'd been renting from an elderly landlord who never raised the rent much, and she'd made the place feel like home with her paintings on the walls and the garden she'd cultivated in the backyard. When I arrived with my boxes, she hugged me tight and told me not to worry, that everything would work out fine. Her husband was cordial enough at first. He worked in middle management at some corporation, the type who wore cheap suits and talked loudly about quarterly projections. He'd moved in after their wedding, contributing to bills, but never quite meshing with the warm atmosphere Mom had always maintained. I noticed immediately how he'd rearranged things, how Mom's favorite chair had been relocated to make room for his oversized recliner, how the thermostat was always set to whatever temperature he preferred regardless of what anyone else wanted. I kept to myself mostly, spending my days job hunting and networking, eating dinner with them when Mom insisted, but otherwise staying in my old bedroom that still had posters from high school on the walls. I contributed to groceries without being asked and kept my space immaculate. The arrangement seemed fine for the first 3 weeks. Then the atmosphere shifted. It started with small comments. He'd mention how the water bill had gone up, how the electricity usage was higher, how the refrigerator seemed emptier faster. He'd say these things during dinner while looking directly at me. His fork paused halfway to his mouth, like he was waiting for me to apologize for existing. Mom would change the subject quickly, her eyes pleading with me to just let it go, and I did because I didn't want to cause her stress. But the comments became more frequent and more pointed. He started talking about responsibility and how adults shouldn't rely on their parents. He'd bring up friends whose kids had moved out and never come back, saying it with this approving tone that made his message crystal clear. Mom would tense up beside him, her hands gripping her napkin, but she never contradicted him directly. I started looking for apartments more aggressively, determined to get out before things escalated further. The job search was going well. I had second interviews lined up with 2 companies, and a former colleague was talking about bringing me into a new venture. I just needed a little more time. Then came the evening that changed everything. I'd been out at an interview that ran late, and I came home around 8 to find him sitting in his recliner with the television on, but his attention wasn't on the screen. Mom was in the kitchen doing dishes, and I could hear the clatter of plates from where I stood in the doorway. He turned to look at me, and there was something calculated in his expression that made my stomach tighten. He told me to sit down, that we needed to have a conversation. I remained standing, keys still in my hand, sensing that whatever was coming wouldn't require me to get comfortable. Mom appeared in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in her hands, her face pale. He launched into a speech about how he'd been thinking about the situation, about how it wasn't fair that I was living there rent-free while he worked hard every day to keep a roof over everyone's heads. The way he said it made it sound like the house was his, like he'd built it with his bare hands instead of just sleeping in the bedroom of a place my mother rented. He talked about market rates and the value of the space I was occupying, throwing around numbers like he'd researched comparable rentals in the area. Then he hit me with it. If I wanted to continue living there, I need to start paying rent. $3,200 a month, due on the 1st, no exceptions. The number was absurd. I knew what rentals went for in that neighborhood. A decent 2-bedroom apartment would run maybe $1,800, $2,000 at most. He was trying to price me out, to make it impossible for me to stay. I looked at Mom, waiting for her to say something, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but she just stood there with that dish towel twisted in her hands, her eyes shiny with unshed tears. He continued, saying that if I couldn't afford it, I was welcome to find somewhere else to live, but those were his terms. He leaned back in his recliner with this satisfied smirk, clearly expecting me to either explode in anger or slink away in defeat. He wanted a reaction, wanted to assert his dominance in what he perceived as his territory. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing through calculations. I'd been careful with money my entire adult life, especially after watching Mom struggle as a single parent. The startup had failed, but I'd gotten out before it completely tanked, and I'd been putting away money for years before that. I had a substantial cushion in savings and investments, more than he probably imagined. I'd been planning to use it for a down payment on a place once I landed a new job, but an idea was forming that felt both crazy and perfectly logical. I told him I'd think about it, and walked to my room without another word. Behind me, I heard Mom's voice, soft and pleading, asking him why he'd do something like that, and his dismissive response about teaching people responsibility. Their voices faded as I closed my door and pulled out my laptop. The house had always been a rental, and Mom had mentioned before that the landlord was getting up there in years. She'd said it casually once, noting that he'd told her he was thinking about selling some of his properties to simplify his life before retirement. I'd filed that information away without thinking much of it, but now it felt like the missing piece of a puzzle. I spent the next hour doing research. Property records showed the landlord owned this house and 3 others in neighboring areas. I found his contact information through a combination of public records and some creative searching. By 10 p.m., I drafted an email introducing myself, explaining that I was interested in purchasing residential property in the area and had heard through family connections that he might be considering selling. I kept it professional and straightforward, providing my credentials and making it clear I was a serious buyer with capital ready. I hit send and tried to sleep, though my mind kept spinning through possibilities and contingencies. The response came the next morning. The landlord wrote back saying he was indeed thinking about liquidating some assets and would be happy to discuss the property. We arranged to meet for coffee that afternoon. He was a kindly man in his late 70s, the type who wore cardigan sweaters and still carried a physical planner. He explained that he'd been a landlord for 40 years but wanted to simplify things and spend more time with his grandchildren. The house we were discussing, Mom's house, was one he'd been considering selling. The tenants were good, he said, never late on rent, always took care of the place. He'd feel bad displacing them, but at his age, he needed to think practically. I told him I understood completely and that the current tenants were actually family, which made him smile. We talked about the property, about the neighborhood, about market values and inspection contingencies. He was asking a fair price, maybe even slightly under market given the condition of the place and the updates Mom had convinced him to do over the years. I'd already been pre-approved for a mortgage as part of my apartment search, but I told him I could do better than that. I could close quickly with a substantial cash portion if he was willing to work with me on timing. His eyes lit up at that. Fast closings with minimal complications were worth their weight in gold to someone trying to simplify their life. We shook hands over our empty coffee cups and agreed to have our respective lawyers draw up the paperwork. The next week was a blur of inspections, appraisals, and legal documents. I worked with a real estate attorney who specialized in fast closings, and I pulled together my resources to make it happen. I liquidated some investments, took a portion from savings, and structured a small mortgage for the remainder. The landlord was motivated and cooperative, and because Mom had kept the place in good condition, the inspection came back clean. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I went to my interviews, came home for dinners where her husband would make pointed comments about my continued presence, and spent my evenings coordinating with lawyers and mortgage brokers. Mom looked increasingly stressed, caught between wanting to support me and not wanting to antagonize her husband. He seemed to grow more smug each day, clearly believing he'd backed me into a corner. 10 days after our initial conversation, the closing happened. I sat in a title company office and signed what felt like 1,000 documents. The landlord shook my hand warmly and told me I was getting a good house, that I should take care of it. I assured him I would. The keys, duplicates of the ones Mom had been using for years, were handed over in a small ceremony that felt surreal. I was now the owner of the house where my mother lived, where I'd grown up, where her husband thought he could dictate terms. I took a day to prepare. I consulted with my attorney about proper procedure, about notice requirements and legal obligations. I wanted everything done correctly, by the book, unassailable. She helped me draft the appropriate documents, and I had them notarized and copied in triplicate. Then I came home on a Thursday evening with a folder under my arm. They were both in the living room, Mom reading a book on the couch while her husband watched some sporting event with the volume too loud. He glanced up when I entered, that familiar smirk already forming. He started to say something about the rent situation, about how time was running out for me to make a decision, but I cut him off. I told them both I had an announcement. Mom looked up from her book, worry creasing her forehead. He muted the television with exaggerated annoyance, clearly preparing to enjoy what he thought would be my admission of defeat. I explained that I'd given the rent situation considerable thought, that I'd analyzed the market and considered my options carefully. He nodded along like a teacher waiting for a student to admit they hadn't done their homework. I let the pause stretch out, watching his confidence build. Then I told him I'd purchased the house. The confusion on his face was almost comical. He asked me to repeat myself, certain he'd misheard. I explained again, slowly and clearly, that I had bought the property from the landlord, that closing had occurred 2 days ago, that I was now the legal owner with the deed filed in my name at the county recorder's office. Mom's book slid from her hands. Her husband's mouth opened and closed without sound. I continued, my voice steady. I told Mom that she didn't need to worry, that I would never charge her rent, that this was and would always be her home for as long as she wanted it. I watched relief and disbelief war across her features as she processed what I was saying. Then I turned to him. I explained that as the new owner, I was exercising my right to determine who lived in my property. I told him I was giving him 30 days' notice to vacate the premises, which was more than the legal minimum, but felt appropriate given the circumstances. I opened the folder and handed him the formal eviction notice, printed on official letterhead, signed and notarized. The document was titled Notice to Quit and laid out in precise legal language that he had 30 days from the date of service to remove himself and all his belongings from the property. It cited relevant state statutes and included information about his rights and obligations during the notice period. His face went through a spectacular journey of expressions. Confusion gave way to shock, shock to anger, anger to something that looked almost like fear. He started to bluster, saying this was ridiculous, that he lived there, that Mom was his wife, and this was his home. I let him finish before responding. I clarified that Mom was absolutely welcome to stay, but the residence was in my name alone, and I as the owner had the right to determine occupancy. I pointed out that he'd never contributed to the actual rent. Mom had been paying that from her own income, and that he had no legal claim to the property whatsoever. I'd already confirmed this with my attorney. As he was not on any lease and had no ownership interest, I could legally require him to leave with appropriate notice, which I was providing. He turned to Mom, demanding she do something, tell me this was insane, but she was staring at the eviction notice in his hands with an expression I couldn't quite read. He appealed to her, reminding her they were married, asking if she was really going to let this happen. The silence stretched out. Mom looked at him, then at me, then back at him. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I expected, but absolutely firm. She told him that maybe this was for the best, that she'd been unhappy for a while, that she'd felt increasingly like a guest in her own home since he'd moved in. His face went red. He started yelling about betrayal and disrespect, about how he'd supported her, and this was how she repaid him. I stepped forward and told him calmly that he needed to lower his voice, that we could handle this like adults, and that the terms of the notice were non-negotiable. If he wanted to consult with an attorney, he was welcome to do so, but they'd tell him the same thing my attorney had already confirmed. He looked between us, realizing he had no leverage, no cards to play. The house wasn't his. The lease had been Mom's. He'd moved into someone else's space and somehow convinced himself it was his domain to control. Now reality was crashing down in the form of a legal document that gave him 4 weeks to figure out his next move. He threw the notice on the coffee table and stormed to the bedroom, slamming the door hard enough to rattle picture frames. Mom and I sat in the resulting silence, her on the couch and me in the chair he'd displaced her favorite seat for. She asked me quietly if I'd really done this, bought the house. I confirmed it, showing her the deed paperwork I'd brought home. Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, actually smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. She told me she couldn't believe I'd done that she never expected it, that she didn't know how to thank me. I told her there was nothing to thank me for. This was her home, had been for years before he showed up, and I wasn't going to let anyone make her feel like a burden in her own space. The house was a good investment anyway. and once I got settled with a new job, I'd probably look for my own place, and she could continue living here without worrying about landlords or rent increases. She hugged me then, crying into my shoulder, and I realized how much stress she'd been carrying. The marriage had been a mistake, something she'd admitted to her sister on the phone in conversations I'd overheard but pretended not to. She tried to make it work, to keep the peace, but he'd slowly taken over every aspect of their shared life until she felt like a visitor in her own existence. The next 30 days were tense. He moved through the house like a ghost, angry and sullen, packing his things with theatrical bitterness. He tried several times to convince Mom to come with him, to leave with him and find a place together, but each time she gently declined. She told him she thought they needed time apart, that maybe this was a sign they'd rushed into things. He hired an attorney who sent a threatening letter claiming some kind of spousal property rights, but my attorney demolished those arguments in a response that cited case law and statutory requirements. He had no claim. The house had never been marital property, and he'd contributed nothing to its acquisition or maintenance beyond some utility bills. On day 28, he loaded the last of his boxes into a moving truck he'd rented. Mom and I watched from the kitchen window as he carried out the oversized recliner that had displaced her chair, struggling with it down the front steps. He cast one last look at the house, his face a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret, before climbing into the truck and driving away. The silence he left behind was profound. Mom stood at the window for a long time, watching the empty street, and I wondered what she was thinking. Eventually, she turned to me and suggested we rearrange the furniture, put her chair back where it belonged. We spent that evening reclaiming the space. Her favorite chair returned to its spot by the window where the light was best for reading. The thermostat got adjusted to the temperature she preferred. The photographs she'd taken down to make room for his sports memorabilia went back up on the walls. With each small change, the house seemed to breathe easier, to settle back into itself. Mom filed for divorce 2 weeks later. He didn't contest it, probably realized there was nothing to fight over. The proceedings were straightforward and cordial in the way things are when both parties just want it to be over. I landed a job about a month after he moved out, a senior position at a tech company with equity and a solid salary. I thought about looking for my own place like I'd planned, but Mom suggested I stay for a while longer, at least until she got used to living alone again. I agreed, and honestly, it felt good to be there, to have dinner together and watch her garden flourish without someone complaining about water usage. 6 months later, I'm still here, though I've been looking at properties to invest in. The job is going well, and I've started seeing someone I met through work. Mom has taken up painting again, something she'd stopped doing after she got married. Her canvases are stacked in what used to be the guest room, vibrant and alive with color. Sometimes I think about that evening when he tried to charge me $3,200 in rent for a room in a house he didn't own. I think about the smug certainty on his face, the way he thought he'd cornered me into submission. The memory of handing him that eviction notice, watching his expression crumble as he read the words, remains one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Mom asked me once if I'd bought the house just to get revenge on him, if that had been my motivation. I told her honestly that it had started as a defensive move, a way to protect myself and her from his bullying, but it had become something more. It became about reclaiming space, about standing up to someone who thought power came from intimidation rather than respect. The house is worth more now than what I paid for it, the market having shifted in favorable ways. My attorney suggested I could sell it for a significant profit, but I won't. This is Mom's home, and as long as she wants to be here, it's hers. Maybe someday I'll sign it over to her officially, put it in her name so she never has to worry about anyone taking it away. For now, though, things are good. Mom is happy, painting in her studio room and tending her garden. I'm building a career and a life, making plans for the future. And somewhere out there, he's probably still trying to figure out how a situation he thought he controlled so completely slipped through his fingers in less than 2 weeks. The best revenge isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as holding up a piece of paper and watching someone realize they never had the power they thought they did.